Welcome to the American Family Association's weekly cable program. AFA is a national organization devoted to strengthening the American family, the very foundation of our civilization. Tonight's topic is A Grace Given, Part 1.
Good evening, everyone. Tonight we're going to air an interview by American Family Association's Frank Schroeder of the author of a new book titled A Grace Given. The author of this beautifully written book is Kent Gilgis. And for the record, Kent Gilgis is my son-in-law. Now we're going to show you the interview.
And thanks for joining us. My name is Frank Schroeder, and we at the American Family Association try to bring you programs which affect your family. We discuss topics such as education, politics, taxes, and religion. Tonight's program is a little bit different. Most couples after getting married make plans and they dream big. They plan to have children, they plan to buy a home, they plan and they plan and they plan. But one thing they usually don't plan for is that one of their children will be stricken with a serious illness. My guest today is a father who was faced with just such a situation. Joining me today is Kent Gilgis, a husband, a father, and the author of a remarkable new book, A Grace Given. The book begins as follows. This is a book about hope and love. It's a book about anguish, sorrow, joy. It's about a dying child named Ellie. Most of all, though, it's about hope. Kent, welcome.
Thank you very much, Frank. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's good to see you. I just first want to commend you on your book. I had an opportunity to read it. Extremely moving. I really appreciate you sharing everything you did, but aside from all that, it was just beautifully written and articulated such a difficult topic. Why don't you first just tell us a little bit about your family?
Sure. Well, Ellie was the oldest of 6 children. My wife and I met at Cornell and were married and had sort of a storybook start to our marriage. We lived first in Germany, and then I had a graduate degree at Oxford University, and so we lived there for a little over a year. And when we moved back to the United States, we conceived Ellie, and she was our first child. We now have 5 other children from ages 11 down, great kids. My youngest child is 5, just turned 5 last week. And we live in upstate New York.
Very good. Tell us a little bit about Ellie, particularly the first several months of Ellie's life. When was she born?
Well, she was born in September of 1993. And at that time, we lived in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, which is above the bridge in really what is sort of the wilderness of Michigan. Liz and I lived on Lake Huron and in a small community of about 500 people. And Ellie was a wonderful little child, beautiful little baby. And as new parents, you know, we were proud. We didn't notice anything unusual until maybe about 6 months, and then we started to have little signs that concerned us, but hard to tell at that point.
Well, just before that, before there were any signs of problems, you described in the book that you kind of lived a charmed life. You had sort of everything out before you. Just talk about that a bit.
Well, I mean, Liz and I both went to terrific colleges. I was doing work that I loved. I was working for the Nature Conservancy. We lived in a place that we both loved. We had gotten to live in Europe. We had spent a year in really a sort of magical year in one of the colleges at Oxford University. Our families are all strong. Liz is the oldest of 7 children. I'm the oldest of 3. Our parents are still together. They're both very close families. And so, you know, it just, everything seemed to go well. And
Now you have a beautiful little girl.
that's right.
Uh,
And she was the first grandchild on both sides. So the first of what now on Liz's side is 28 grandchildren, and on my side is 8 kids.
Now, there comes a point where you start to get some little signs that maybe Ellie is having some problems. Describe that for us.
You know, at the time, I don't think we really had a good sense. We had nothing to compare it to. As new parents,
First child?
didn't really know, didn't see warning signs. But there were times when Liz and I both wondered if her eyesight was very good, if she could see us. She didn't seem to track when we were with her, and she didn't look at other children around her. And so I think it was the eyesight that initially got Liz to go get her checked by an ophthalmologist who saw something that concerned him.
You describe back in April of '94, I believe your wife takes Ellie to this doctor's appointment. I think you're away. You
Yeah.
come back to the airport, and
Yeah.
it wasn't really on your radar screen as a big emergency, and you call home.
Yeah, well, Liz had gone to see an ophthalmologist who saw something that concerned him. What he described it as was the nerve endings were pale. That didn't mean anything to us, but he wanted a specialist down in Ann Arbor to see her. And so I was away on a business trip, and Liz was driving down to Ann Arbor, and we were going to meet in Ann Arbor. And she was going to pick me up at the airport and bring me back to a friend's house where we were staying that night. And when she wasn't there, I called to ask where she was and was she going to pick me up. And she couldn't really talk. And what had happened is she went to see the specialist, and he had said that he was worried that there might be a mass in her head. And Liz couldn't talk. She couldn't tell me that over the phone. I knew there was something wrong, so I
So she couldn't talk, just upset. She was
just
crying.
upset. She wanted to talk to me in person,
Okay.
and she was crying. And so, I had a 25-minute wait. So I called her parents, and she had talked to them already, and they gave me the news that Ellie may have a brain tumor.
All clear sailing sort of stops overnight. Big change.
It turns your world upside down.
One of the things I really appreciated about the book is, as I would read some of these things that are happening, I'm saying to myself, I'd just sort of fall apart. And you pretty much described that for you and your wife too. This isn't sugar-coated and, oh yes, we'll bite your bottom lip and move forward. There was some real anguish.
Yeah, people use the cliche of a roller coaster ride, but it was we would hit what we thought was bottom, and then we'd get worse news after that, and we'd go down a step, and we'd sort of climb out of that hole, and we'd get more worse news, and so there were definite ups in there, or at least plateaus, but it was sort of a cascading series of events.
And it happens pretty quickly. Let's talk about that. I mean, at first you're told there's some type of mass. Ellie may have a brain tumor. She's now 7 months?
She was about 8 months at that point.
And ultimately, you go to specialists, and that's confirmed.
Well, one of the hardest things was they told us there was a big demand for MRIs at that point. It was a fairly new technology, and that the earliest they could get us in, they told us, we think she might have a brain tumor, and then they said the earliest we can get her in is 2 weeks. You can imagine what that's like to go home, wondering if there's a brain tumor, having people throw terminology at you, malign, malignant, benign.
You describe that too. You instantly sort of take upon yourself to become as much of an expert as you can in brain tumors and terminology.
Well, you have to. You know, you're faced with, ultimately, you as parents have to make life and death decisions. And I think both of us felt we're not going to make those in a vacuum. We need to know as much as we possibly could.
When you finally learn that Ellie does in fact have a brain tumor, the prognosis is not good.
Right. So we went down. Ellie actually, before the scheduled appointment, Ellie went limp on one side one morning, and we rushed her to the hospital. They medevaced her down to Ann Arbor, 3 or 4 hours away. And you know, at that point, we were very concerned. They thought she might have had a stroke, or that she was having, you know, complications from the brain tumor, but they didn't have the equipment to really tell us what was going on. So we went down to Ann Arbor. All of our families flew in that afternoon, and we all got there about the same time. And then they did the MRIs and they did a bunch of tests. And as we waited, sort of talking quietly amongst ourselves, in walked the doctors and essentially said, it's an inoperable brain tumor in the worst part of her brain, and you know, she has a matter of months to live.
We're actually coming up on the halfway point of the program. I'm speaking with Kent Gilges in our studio today, talking to you about his new book, A Grace Given. I strongly recommend that you read this book, and we'll give you some more information on it as the program goes on. The book isn't just for families with a child with a terminal illness. I just find some of the questions that you raise. Families don't plan for these types of things, but there isn't a family that goes on that isn't going to be faced with crisis and anguish. And I think your book really helps anybody with these types of situations get through it. A little bit more just about our author. Where did you grow up? Where were you born and raised?
I grew up actually very close to where we live now, in upstate New York. Liz and I live in a small town called Canandaigua, which is on one of the Finger Lakes in western New York. So we're about 30 minutes southeast of Rochester. And I spent, you know, up through high school living there. And then both of us went to school only about an hour and a half from there at Cornell, which is where we met. Okay. And started dating there. Although Liz will tell the story that she actually never dated me in college, but it's not true. She did.
And I can understand her reluctance to admit that. You have a background in journalism.
Yeah.
Your writing is terrific. Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, you know, I actually started writing early, and when I first came out of college, went off to Idaho and started writing articles and tried to write a book. Went to Europe and lived in Italy and wrote articles there for various magazines. And then while I was there, took a job with McGraw-Hill Publishing Company as an editor for them in Frankfurt, Germany. And so I spent probably 4 years working in publishing and doing a lot of writing. I wrote for magazines and National Public Radio and some other things.
Well, it shows. Just sort of picking up, you're now given this grim news that your daughter has perhaps months to live. And you and Liz at that point make a pledge to one another. And just tell us a little bit about that.
Well, it's, I'm not sure I would describe it as a pledge. It was more sort of just a mutual decision that we reached without even discussing it. And you know, the question was, okay, it's an inoperable brain tumor. They tell us that we will have this child for a matter of months. And one of the things that I remember Liz saying is, you know, how will I live without, she asked her mom, how will I live without a child in the house to go home to? And her mom said, well, God gives you the grace you need when you need it. And it was as if at that moment, grace sort of descended on us, and we just decided that, and we knew that this was the right course, that if we only had her for a few months, we wanted her to be in as happy and loving and joyful a place as possible. And that place was back in Port Washington at Liz's parents' house, with all of her siblings around.
Which, ironically, is where we're filming from today.
That's where we're sitting right now. So we came back to this house, and honestly, Ellie was never put down as a child. She just went from sibling to sibling. It's funny, Liz and I were looking at videos of that period just yesterday, and I don't think I realized it, but it was immediately obvious to me how Liz's family, and my family for that matter, sort of dropped their lives, and Ellie became the center of their lives. They just sort of gave up everything else and helped us take care of her and really pulled together as a family, and it's really a beautiful thing.
So your commitment to make sure that this child's short, limited life would be full of love and affection.
Right.
That's not exactly the way the story goes.
No.
You all are, you now go through this period of waiting initially, not knowing when Ellie's last day would be, and there comes a time you learn that there may be a surgeon who can help, and things change. First of all, during this period, I just want to read a section of your book. I thought it was beautiful. You talk about praying for a miracle, and you say, I don't know about the others, but I prayed for a specific miracle. I prayed for a cure. I thought if we were to get a miracle, it would be sudden and complete, that my daughter would be cured, and I would know God's existence. The real miracle, as I've come to see, was something different than perhaps any of us expected. It did not come suddenly, rather it grew into us. It grew into everyone that touched Ellie. How would you describe the miracle? What was the miracle as you see it?
Time. You know, Liz's, as we prayed over Ellie in Ann Arbor and got that horrible news that we would lose her, you know, what we most wanted was a cure, but I think what God gave us was time. And you know, we had Ellie for 10 years after that. So that enabled us to have 5 other children who knew her, for her to touch all of our lives, and all of the people around us who got to know her.
Touched a lot of lives.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about that. Other people's, how this affected other people that came to meet the family.
You know, it's almost hard to quantify, but so many people came in contact with us and with Ellie from caregivers, through friends, and then friends telling their friends about it, and we would get calls from people in Minnesota or Chicago who were praying for Ellie and had heard about her and had seen pictures of her. We had a friend in Italy who was a friend of Liz's that we knew from Oxford, who was actually a princess, and she was praying for Ellie, and you know, eventually we went to visit.
Literally a princess.
A princess, yeah. And we went to visit with her, and partly through her ended up meeting John Paul II. But it just seemed to stretch out, this web of people that were involved with Ellie.
This sick child is now first told, and you're first told that this is an operable brain tumor, and you but you resign yourself to Ellie's death within months. Ultimately, you determine that Ellie is a candidate for surgery, and the surgery occurs. Just tell us a little bit about that. what happened after the surgery? What was the result?
Well, you know, the initial prognosis was done at a hospital. It's a great hospital, CS Mott in Ann Arbor, but I don't think they see as many of these types of tumors as other places might. So we went to a doctor in New York who said we could operate on her, and the operation in many ways was very successful. They removed about 90% of the tumor, but unfortunately in the recovery room she had a stroke, and it was really the stroke that then defined who she was after that. She couldn't walk, she couldn't talk, she couldn't eat on her own, she couldn't care for herself in any way. She had no sort of voluntary movement.
Blind?
She
Couldn't
was
see.
blind, yep.
Okay.
So, you know, doctors described her as being in a persistent vegetative state.
And I know you hate that term.
I don't like that term at all. I don't agree with it.
Mhm.
She was aware of what was going on around her. She had her own way of communicating. She was very much a person. But, you know, she was completely dependent on us and her other caregivers.
You describe it in your book, trying to make a decision, and you say, my biggest fear is that Ellie will wind up living a miserable life in hospitals, going through treatment after treatment, slowly wasting away. If it's a choice between that and letting her go, you would let her go. Some decision for a young father and mother to have to make, to undergo this brain surgery, and then for things to develop the way they did. Your thoughts on that now?
You know, afterwards, as I think about it, my greatest fear was exactly what God gave me, and I realize now there was nothing to be afraid of, and you know, maybe that's part of the grace of her life, is that it allowed Liz and I both to sort of confront our fears and our you know, what most concerns us about our own lives, and realize that they were blessings, not something to fear.
Let's talk about blessings and what God gives. Kent, when this story begins, would you consider yourself a religious man? Or?
No, I was raised in a non-religious house, and so, you know, I clearly have a very strong belief in God, but I'm not religious at all.
When this is developing and Ellie winds up in her condition after the surgery, you must have had a few questions for God.
You know, Frank, I don't think I ever, it was, I think a lot of people ask a question when they're confronted with sorrow or suffering or difficulties. Why me, or why did God do this to me, or why does God create suffering? I actually don't think Liz or I ever asked that question. It just didn't occur to us. You sort of deal with what you get.
I understand there's a video of Ellie. She didn't have a lot of time before the surgery, but she did manage to get a few words out at some point. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, Ellie never spoke to us except once, and it was just before she went in for surgery. We captured it on video. I wasn't even in the house, so I never got to hear it except on video. But she was being held by a close friend of the family, and she was standing at the end of the dining room table, and she was bouncing up and down on somebody's lap, and out of the blue, for the first time ever, 2 days before she was to go in for surgery, she just started saying, "Da, da, 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 da," and we got about 30 seconds of that on video. It's the only thing she ever said to us.
Wonderful. This is going to be part one of a two-part story. We're going to talk to your wife and you next, and we'll talk some more about this. But just about the natural or the day-to-day process of what it's like being with Ellie during these 10 years. But Ellie dies on May 4th, 2004. lived with you for 10 years. As you said, your other children got to know her. In fact, I understand that family was actually involved in making her coffin.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, you
How,
know,
how do the other young children come to understand death or that kind of sickness?
it's hard to know if they understood it or not.
It's hard
but
for an adult to understand it.
Yeah, yeah.
So I guess they do it in their own way.
Right, but when Ellie died, you know, my father and I told my dad we've always worked together on wood projects and things like that, and I told him that I wanted to be the one that built her coffin. So he helped me. We built it, and then we painted it, and my parents ended up creating the inside, the pillows and stuff like that. And then our children each colored their hands with paint and put 2 handprints on it and then wrote, "I love you, Ellie," underneath it.
Just want to read a little portion of your book and your ability to articulate some of these things. Question that's often asked is, why does God create brain tumors? And you write, the answer is to make us more beautiful, more like Him, to fill us with grace. It's a great paradox and mystery that suffering is the path to holiness. Those who ask the question about God creating brain tumors focus on the imperfection of the body, yet they should focus on the perfection of the soul. God is not revealed in what happens to us, but in how we react to what happens to us. Goodness is revealed, or not revealed, in the choices we make and the intentions that drive those choices. Kent, I want to thank you for sitting with us today and sharing this. I look forward to the second part of our program. I also want to urge our listeners to read this book, A Grace Given, by Kent Gilges. And we're going to put some information on the screen more about the book and how you can read some excerpts from the book. This is a powerful book, and it's going to help you and your families get through the tough times. Thank you.
Yes, we want to hear more. Yes, yes, Mom. Say, Mommy.
Listen.
Daddy.
This program was brought to you by the American Family Association of New York. For further information on A Grace Given by Kent Gilges, you may contact American Family Association of New York, P.O. Box 203, Port Washington, New York, 11050. Telephone 516-944-3544, www.afany.org.